25 years of marriage, and he was using our silver anniversary party to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Helen's cooking, he announced to our gathered guests, his voice carrying that mocking tone I'd grown to despise. Let me tell you about Helen's famous lasagna disaster from last Tuesday. I stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, watching 50 of our closest friends and family members turn their attention to my husband as he launched into an exaggerated tale of my recent culinary mishap. The professional caterers I'd hired moved silently around the room, serving the elegant dinner I'd spent months planning, while Robert painted me as some bumbling housewife who couldn't boil water. She confused salt for sugar in the sauce, he continued, gesturing dramatically with his wine glass. 3 hours of cooking, and we had to order pizza like college kids. The guests laughed politely, but I caught the uncomfortable glances, the subtle eye rolls from my sister Margaret and my childhood friend Carol. They'd witnessed Robert's pattern of public humiliation before, though never quite this boldly. My mother-in-law, Dorothy, stood near the fireplace wearing her customary disapproving expression. At 78, she still carried herself like the society matron she'd always been, and she'd never hidden her belief that Robert had married beneath his station. Tonight, she was practically glowing with satisfaction as her son reduced me to a punchline. The poor delivery boy thought we were having a neighborhood barbecue, Robert continued, now addressing our neighbors Bill and Susan Whitmore directly. Helen answered the door in her apron, sauce-stained and flustered, trying to explain why the smoke alarm kept going off. I forced a smile, playing the part I'd perfected over 2.5 decades. The good wife, the patient spouse, the woman who laughed along when her husband used her mistakes as entertainment. Inside, something hard and cold was crystallizing in my chest. Our children were scattered around the room. David, 32, and freshly promoted to senior partner at his law firm, was nursing his whiskey and avoiding eye contact. Sarah, 28 and 7 months pregnant with our first grandchild, looked mortified as she whispered something to her husband, Jake. Even they were tired of their father's routine. Robert raised his glass higher, commanding attention like the courtroom attorney he'd been for 3 decades. "But that's our Helen," he declared with theatrical fondness. "Keeps life interesting with her little adventures in domestic chaos." The toast that followed was half-hearted, at best. I lifted my own glass, smiling that practiced smile while fury burned in my throat like acid. 25 years of building a life together, and this was how he chose to commemorate it. Not with gratitude or love or even basic respect, but with public mockery disguised as affectionate teasing. Margaret approached me as the crowd began to mingle again, her face tight with controlled anger. At 62, my older sister had never learned to hide her feelings, a trait that had served her well as a high school principal, but often made social gatherings uncomfortable. "Helen," she said quietly, her hand touching my arm, "you don't have to—" "It's fine," I interrupted, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "You know how Robert is at parties. He likes to entertain." "That wasn't entertaining," Margaret replied sharply. "That was cruel." Before I could respond, Dorothy materialized beside us, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her smile sharp as a blade. "Helen, dear," she said in her cultured Boston accent, "perhaps next time you might consider taking some cooking classes. The community college offers them, I believe." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The suggestion hit like a slap. I'd been cooking for my family for 25 years, had hosted countless dinner parties, had received genuine compliments on my meals from everyone, except the 2 people whose opinions Robert seemed to value most, his mother and himself. "I'll look into it," I managed, hating the submissive tone in my voice. Dorothy nodded approvingly and glided away to join Robert near the bar. where he was already launching into another story about my supposed incompetence. This time, it was about my parallel parking, complete with hand gestures and sound effects. Carol appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with indignation. We'd been friends since high school, and she'd watched my transformation from confident young woman to apologetic wife with growing concern. 25 years, Helen, she said under her breath. 25 years, and this is how he treats you. At your own anniversary party? I looked around the room I'd spent weeks preparing. The silver and white decorations I'd carefully chosen. The anniversary photos I'd arranged on the mantelpiece, chronicling our journey from young newlyweds to middle-aged parents. The menu I'd planned with the caterers, featuring all of Robert's favorite dishes. Everything had been perfect, everything except the guest of honor's behavior. He's had too much wine, I said automatically, another well-practiced excuse. You know how lawyers get when they have an audience. Carol studied my face with the shrewd gaze that had made her an excellent pediatric nurse for 30 years. This isn't about the wine, and you know it. She was right, of course. The wine was just lubricating tendencies that had been growing, stronger over the years. The dismissive comments, the public corrections, the way he'd begun treating me like an amusing but slightly incompetent roommate rather than his partner and equal. When had it started? I tried to pinpoint the moment our marriage had shifted from partnership to performance art, with me as the willing fool. Perhaps it was when Robert had made senior partner at his firm 10 years ago, his confidence blooming into arrogance. Or maybe it had been gradual, so subtle that I'd adjusted to each new level of disrespect until this became normal. Helen! Robert's voice boomed across the room. Come tell everyone about your adventure at the grocery store yesterday, the one with the automatic doors. Another wave of laughter rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to me. I could feel my cheeks burning, but I walked toward my husband with measured steps, that familiar smile plastered on my face. It wasn't that interesting, I said mildly. Oh, but it was, Robert insisted, draping his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to observers, but felt possessive and controlling to me. Tell them about the censor. I knew I could refuse. I could simply shake my head and change the subject. But 25 years of conditioning had taught me that resistance only made things worse. Better to play along, get through the evening, and address it privately later. Except, later never seemed to come. There was always another party, another audience, another opportunity for Robert to position himself as the long-suffering husband of a charmingly incompetent wife. The automatic doors were malfunctioning, I began reluctantly, already knowing how Robert would embellish the story. They kept opening and closing. She stood there for 5 minutes. Robert jumped in, unable to let me tell it myself. 5 minutes, trying to time her entrance like she was planning a bank heist. The poor stockboy had to come rescue her. The laughter that followed felt like needles under my skin. I glanced around the room, noting which faces showed genuine amusement and which displayed polite discomfort. Our longtime neighbors were clearly uncomfortable. Several of Robert's law firm colleagues seemed to be enjoying the show. My family looked mortified, but it was Sarah's face that broke something inside me. My pregnant daughter was staring at her father with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure disgust. Her hand rested protectively on her rounded belly, and I realized with crushing clarity that she was seeing her father through the eyes of a woman about to become a mother herself. Seeing how a husband could systematically diminish his wife, and wondering if she'd married a man capable of the same behavior. The evening dragged on with Robert's commentary, providing a running soundtrack to every interaction. When I complimented the caterers, he corrected my pronunciation of béarnaise sauce. When I chatted with our neighbor about her garden, he interrupted to share the hilarious story of my failed attempt to grow tomatoes. When I tried to discuss a book I'd recently enjoyed, he dismissed it as one of Helen's romance novels. though it had actually been a critically acclaimed work of historical fiction. Each small humiliation built upon the last until I felt like I was drowning in embarrassment. The worst part wasn't just Robert's behavior, but my own automatic responses, the nervous laughter, the self-deprecating jokes, the way I'd learned to participate in my own diminishment. By 10 o'clock, guests were beginning to leave. The standard round of thank yous and air kisses commenced, but I noticed how many people avoided prolonged eye contact with me. Were they embarrassed for me? Or had they simply accepted Robert's version of our dynamic as truth? Margaret lingered until the end, helping me carry glasses to the kitchen while Robert held court with the last few stragglers in the living room. "Helen," she said as we loaded the dishwasher, "this has to stop." "What has to stop?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what she meant. "This!" She gestured toward the living room where Robert's voice could still be heard regaling someone with yet another tale of my supposed inadequacy. "The way he treats you. The way you let him treat you." I paused in rinsing a champagne flute, studying my reflection in its crystal surface. When had I started looking so tired? When had my shoulders begun to curve inward like I was permanently bracing for impact? "He's my husband," I said quietly. "That doesn't give him the right to use you as entertainment," Margaret replied sharply. "Mom and Dad didn't raise us to accept this kind of treatment." She was right. Our parents had modeled a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Dad had never made Mom the butt of his jokes. He'd never diminished her intelligence or mocked her efforts in front of others. They'd been true partners until Dad's death 5 years ago. "It's complicated," I said, the words tasting like ash. "No, Helen, it's really not." Margaret dried her hands on a kitchen towel, her movements sharp with frustration. "It's actually very simple. Either you demand better, or you accept this as your life for whatever years you have left." The finality in her voice shook something loose inside me. Whatever years I have left. At 53, I potentially had decades ahead of me. Decades of Robert's public mockery. Decades of shrinking smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely into the role of amusing, incompetent wife. The thought was terrifying. After Margaret left, I stood in my perfectly appointed living room, surveying the damage. Lipstick-stained glasses, crumpled napkins, the detritus of an evening that should have celebrated our love but had instead showcased my humiliation. Robert emerged from his study where he'd been saying goodbye to his law partners. He was still riding the high of having held center stage. All evening, his face flushed with satisfaction and wine. "Great party, Helen," he said, loosening his tie. "Everyone had a wonderful time." I stared at him. This man I'd loved since I was 28 years old. Robert had been handsome then, confident in a way that had seemed attractive rather than arrogant. He'd pursued me relentlessly, showering me with attention and making me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. When had that changed? When had I become his source of amusement rather than admiration? "Did you enjoy making fun of me all night?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Robert's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Making fun of you? Helen, I was just telling stories. Everyone loves those stories." "They're not stories, Robert. They're humiliations. My humiliations, served up for everyone's entertainment." He studied my face with the careful attention he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "You're being overly sensitive," he said finally. "It's just harmless fun between spouses. Everyone does it." "No," I said quietly. "Everyone doesn't do it. Everyone doesn't spend their anniversary party making their wife look foolish." Robert's expression shifted to that patient tone he used when explaining obvious things to obviously stupid people. "Helen, you're taking this too seriously. I was just lightening the mood. People expect it from us now. People expect it from us." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Our dynamic had become so established, so predictable, that our friends and family now expected me to be the target of Robert's wit, expected me to smile and take it, expected me to be grateful for the attention even if it was negative. "I don't want people to expect it," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I don't want to be your comedy routine anymore." Robert's face darkened, and I saw a flash of the temper he usually kept carefully controlled in public. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said curtly. "Maybe if you didn't give me so much material to work with, there wouldn't be any stories to tell." The implication hung in the air between us like poison. If I were more competent, more careful, more perfect, he wouldn't have to mock me. My failures justified his cruelty. I looked at this man who had vowed to love and cherish me, who had promised to be my partner through whatever life brought us. Instead, he had become my biggest critic, my most persistent tormentor, the person who knew exactly which weaknesses to exploit for maximum effect. "I'm going to bed," I said, turning toward the stairs. "Helen," Robert called after me, his tone softer now. "Don't be like this. You know I love you. You know it's all just fun." I paused on the bottom step without turning around. "If this is how you show love, Robert, I'd hate to see how you treat people you actually dislike." In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at myself in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. Had I become so pale, so diminished? When had I started carrying myself like an apology? 25 years ago, I'd been Helen Catherine Morrison, a confident young woman with a master's degree in literature and dreams of becoming a college professor. I'd been bright, funny, engaged with the world around me. I'd had opinions and ambitions and a sense of my own worth. Somewhere along the way, I'd become Helen Morrison, Robert's wife. The woman who existed primarily as background to his success, as comic relief to his importance, as a safe target for his need to feel superior. But as I sat there in the aftermath of my own anniversary party, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever before, something began to shift inside me. Something that had been dormant for years was stirring to life, awakening like a flame finally given oxygen. I walked to my closet and reached behind my winter coats, pulling out a small fireproof box I'd hidden there months ago. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to need: bank statements, property records, financial information I'd quietly gathered during moments of clarity about my marriage's trajectory. Because despite what Robert believed about my competence, despite the image he'd cultivated of me as a scatterbrained housewife, I wasn't stupid. I'd been watching, planning, preparing for the day when I might need options. That day had apparently arrived. I opened my laptop and began typing, my fingers moving with purpose for the first time in years. If Robert wanted to treat me like a punchline, he was about to discover that this particular joke had a very unexpected ending. The morning after our anniversary party, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Robert lay beside me, snoring softly, still smelling of expensive wine and his own satisfaction. In the gray light filtering through our bedroom curtains, he looked older than his 55 years, his face slack with the arrogance that had become his default expression even in sleep. Slipped from bed without waking him and padded downstairs to my home office, the small room Robert dismissed as Helen's Craft Corner, though he had no idea what I actually did there during the long hours he spent at the firm or the golf course. The computer hummed to life, and I opened the encrypted folder I'd created 6 months ago when Robert's public humiliation had escalated from occasional to systematic. Inside were screenshots, documents, and carefully organized records that painted a very different picture of our marriage than the one Robert presented to the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Couldn't sleep either. Coffee at 8? We need to talk." I typed back quickly, "Make it 7:30, Starbucks on Elm." The next hour flew by as I compiled everything I'd been quietly gathering. Bank statements showing Robert's spending habits, the expensive lunches with his secretary, the jewelry purchases that never made it home to me, the hotel charges on nights when he claimed to be working late, credit card records revealing a pattern of expenditures that suggested a lifestyle far more extravagant than what he shared with his supposedly incompetent wife. But the financial records were just the beginning. The real evidence was in the details. Robert never thought I'd notice or understand. At exactly 7:25, I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. Robert was still dead to the world, and I left him a note saying I was meeting Margaret for coffee, a truth that would cover my absence without raising suspicion. Margaret was already seated in the corner booth when I arrived, 2 large coffees waiting on the table. At 62, my sister had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from 30 years of dealing with teenagers and administrators. She'd divorced her first husband 20 years ago when she discovered his gambling problem, and she'd never looked back. "You look different," she said as I slid into the booth across from her. "Different how?" "Awake," she replied simply. "Like you've been sleepwalking for years and finally opened your eyes." I sipped my coffee, choosing my words carefully. "What would you do if you discovered your husband wasn't the man you thought he was?" Margaret's eyes sharpened. "What did you find?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a photograph I'd taken weeks ago. Robert at an expensive restaurant downtown, his arm around a woman who definitely wasn't me. The woman was younger, blonde, and wearing jewelry that looked remarkably similar to pieces I'd admired, but Robert had claimed we couldn't afford. "Her name is Vanessa Chen," I said quietly. "She's a paralegal at Robert's firm. 28 years, old, recently divorced, no children." Margaret studied the photo, her jaw tightening. "How long have you known?" I suspected for months. I confirmed it 3 weeks ago. I scrolled to another image, Robert and Vanessa entering a hotel, his hand possessively on her lower back. "They meet every Tuesday and Thursday for lunch. Sometimes those lunches last until evening." "Helen," Margaret breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sympathy. "There's more." I showed her copies of credit card statements. The jewelry he bought her, the weekend trips he told me were work conferences, the expensive dinners, while I was home eating leftover Chinese food and wondering why he seemed so distant. Margaret reached across the table and gripped my hand. "I'm so sorry. But, Helen, this changes everything. You don't have to put up with his treatment anymore. You have grounds for—" "I'm not filing for divorce," I interrupted. She stared at me. "What?" "Not yet, anyway." I leaned back in the booth, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. "Robert thinks I'm too stupid to notice his affair. He thinks I'm too dependent to leave him. He thinks I'm too weak to fight back. And?" A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. "He's about to discover just how wrong he is about his bumbling, incompetent wife." I spent the next 2 hours outlining my plan to Margaret, watching her expression shift from concern to amazement to something approaching admiration. By the time we parted ways, she understood exactly what I intended to do and why Robert's days of public humiliation were about to come to an abrupt end. Back home, Robert was in the kitchen making coffee, still in his pajamas and looking irritated about having to fend for himself. "Where were you?" he asked without looking up. "Coffee with Margaret. I left you a note." I didn't see it. He turned to face me, his expression mildly annoyed. "I was hoping you'd make breakfast. I have an important meeting this morning." The old Helen would have apologized and rushed to the stove. The new Helen simply poured herself orange juice and sat at the breakfast bar. "There are eggs in the refrigerator," I said pleasantly. "I'm sure you can manage." Robert's eyebrows rose. "Are you feeling all right? You seem different." "I'm fine. Just tired from last night's party." He studied my face with the attention he usually reserved for cross-examinations. "You're not still upset about the stories, are you? Helen, you know I didn't mean anything by it." "Of course not," I replied, my voice perfectly neutral. "Why would I be upset about being made fun of at my own anniversary party?" The sarcasm was subtle enough that Robert missed it entirely. He relaxed, clearly relieved that his wife was back to her predictable, accommodating self. "Good," he said, moving to the refrigerator. "Because I might be late tonight. Big case coming up, lots of. Preparation needed." I nodded sympathetically. "Will you be working with Vanessa on the case?" Robert's hand froze on the refrigerator handle. For just a moment, his entire body went rigid. Then he turned slowly, his face carefully composed. "Vanessa?" "Vanessa Chen, the paralegal. You've mentioned her before." I kept my tone light, curious. "She seems very dedicated to her work." "She's competent," Robert said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason. I was just thinking it must be nice to work with people who share your dedication to excellence." Robert visibly relaxed. "Yes, well, not everyone can maintain professional standards." The implicit criticism of me was automatic, reflexive. I smiled sweetly. "No, I suppose not everyone can." After Robert left for the office, I returned to my computer and opened a new document. At the top, I typed, "The Complete Guide to Robert Morrison's Double Life." What followed was 3 hours of methodical documentation. Every lunch meeting with Vanessa. Every lie about working late. Every expensive purchase disguised as a business expense. Every hotel reservation made on nights when he'd claimed to be reviewing case files. But I didn't stop with the affair. I delved deeper into Robert's professional life, using skills I'd developed during my graduate studies in research methodology, skills Robert had never bothered to acknowledge or respect. What I discovered was a pattern of ethical corners being cut. Client funds temporarily borrowed from trust accounts, billing hours inflated on routine cases, small violations, nothing that would warrant criminal charges, but certainly enough to interest the State Bar Association. The most damaging discovery came when I cross-referenced Robert's calendar with his billing records. The Tuesday and Thursday lunch meetings with Vanessa were being billed to clients as case preparation time. Robert was literally charging his affairs to his unsuspecting clients. By noon, I had compiled a dossier that would destroy Robert's career, his reputation, and his sense of superiority all at once. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. The timing had to be perfect. My phone rang just after lunch. "Helen Morrison speaking." "Mrs. Morrison?" "This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Women's Health Associates. I have your test results." I'd completely forgotten about the appointment I'd scheduled weeks ago. The routine physical that had included some additional tests Dr. Walsh had recommended. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Walsh continued. "Your blood work is perfect. Bone density is wonderful for your age, and I'm happy to report that all your tests came back completely normal." "Thank you," I said, though my mind was elsewhere. "I did want to mention something, though. You seemed quite stressed during your last visit. Are you taking care of yourself emotionally as well as physically?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm fine, doctor." "Helen, we've been working together for 8 years. You've seemed increasingly anxious during your recent visits. If there's anything going on at home or in your personal life that's causing you stress, there are resources available to help." I found myself gripping the phone tighter. "What kind of resources?" "Counseling, support groups, legal advice if needed. Sometimes women your age find themselves facing transitions in their marriages or family situations. The careful way she phrased it told me that Dr. Walsh had seen this pattern before. Women who came in looking increasingly diminished, increasingly apologetic about their own existence. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine." "I'm sure you are. But Helen, remember that managing and thriving are two very different things." After I hung up, I sat staring at my reflection in the dark computer screen. Dr. Walsh was right. I had been managing, not thriving. Managing Robert's moods, managing social situations, managing my own shrinking sense of self. But that was about to change. I spent the afternoon making phone calls, though not the kind Robert would expect from his supposedly simple wife. I contacted a private investigator I'd found through careful research. I scheduled an appointment with a divorce attorney Margaret had recommended. I opened a separate bank account at a different branch of our bank. Each action felt like stepping out of a cage I'd built around myself over 25 years. The private investigator, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, agreed to meet me that evening at a coffee shop across town. She was in her 50s, professionally dressed, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every story and seen every kind of betrayal. "You've done impressive work on your own," she said after reviewing the documents I'd brought. "Most people come to me with suspicions and feelings. You've come with evidence. Is it enough? For a divorce? Absolutely. For what you have in mind?" She smiled grimly. "It's a good start, but if you really want to make him pay for 25 years of humiliation, we need to go deeper." Patricia outlined the next steps: additional surveillance, financial forensics, professional misconduct documentation. It would take several weeks to build the complete case, but when we were finished, Robert would face consequences far beyond embarrassment. "One thing I need to know," Patricia said as we prepared to leave. "Are you prepared for the fallout? When men like your husband are cornered, they don't go quietly. They fight dirty." I thought about the woman I'd been 12 hours ago, the one who'd smiled and played along while her husband made her a laughingstock. Then I thought about the woman I was becoming, the one who'd spent her morning building an arsenal of truth. "Let him fight," I said quietly. "He's about to discover that his incompetent wife learned a few things during those years he was busy underestimating her." Patricia grinned. "This is going to be fun." That evening, Robert arrived home in an excellent mood, practically glowing with satisfaction. He kissed my cheek absently and headed straight for his study. "How was your meeting?" I called after him. "Productive," he replied. "Very productive indeed." I'll bet it was, I thought, imagining him and Vanessa celebrating their successful deception. Little did they know that their Tuesday and Thursday lunch meetings had been photographed, documented, and cataloged with forensic precision. As Robert settled into his evening routine of expensive scotch and case files, I retreated to my home office and opened a new folder on my computer. Project Renaissance. Because that's what this was, really. My own personal renaissance. A rebirth from the ashes of who I'd allowed myself to become. I began typing the first phase of my plan, my fingers moving across the keyboard with growing confidence. Robert thought he knew his wife. He thought he understood her limitations, her weaknesses, her complete dependence on his superior intelligence and social standing. Tomorrow, he would begin to learn just how catastrophically wrong he'd been. But tonight, I would let him enjoy his illusions of control just a little longer. After all, the best revelations require perfect timing, and I was nothing if not patient. 25 years of patient, as it turned out. But my patience was about to pay dividends that Robert could never have imagined. 3 weeks had passed since our anniversary party, and Robert had settled back into his comfortable routine of dismissive superiority. He had no idea that every Tuesday and Thursday lunch meeting was being photographed, every credit card charge documented, every lie carefully recorded in my growing digital archive. This particular Thursday morning found me in the kitchen, playing the role of dutiful wife with an Oscar-worthy performance. I hummed softly while making Robert's coffee exactly the way he liked it, 2 sugars and a splash of cream, served in his favorite mug with the law firm logo. "You seem cheerful this morning," Robert observed, adjusting his silk tie. Even at 55, he remained handsome in that distinguished lawyer way, though I now noticed how his charm never quite reached his eyes when he looked at me. "It's a beautiful day," I replied, handing him the steaming mug. "You have that important client lunch today, don't you?" Robert's hand barely paused as he accepted the coffee. After 25 years of marriage, he'd grown so confident in my Ignorance that he no longer bothered to craft elaborate lies. Yes, the Peterson case requires extensive consultation with the paralegal team, he said smoothly. I nodded sympathetically. Vanessa seems like such a dedicated professional. You're lucky to have someone so committed to thorough research. This time, Robert did pause, studying my face with the wariness of a man who'd spent his career reading people for signs of deception. But he saw only the same mild, supportive wife he'd trained me to be over 2 decades. She's adequate, he said, finally, then quickly changed the subject. I'll be late again tonight. This case is consuming. Of course. I'll keep dinner warm. After Robert left, I waited exactly 15 minutes before making my first call. Patricia, it's Helen. He just confirmed today's meeting. Perfect, came the private investigator's crisp voice through the phone. My photographer will be in position. How are you handling the emotional side of this? It was a fair question. Watching evidence of your husband's betrayal accumulate daily should have been devastating. Instead, I felt strangely detached, as if I were watching someone else's marriage disintegrate under a microscope. I feel like I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in years, I admitted. That's common in cases like this. You're processing grief, but you're also discovering your own strength. How's the financial investigation proceeding? I smiled, settling into my home office chair. Better than expected. Robert's always been careless with paperwork when he thinks no one is paying attention. What Patricia didn't know was that my investigation had expanded far beyond documenting Robert's affair. During the long hours he spent with Vanessa, I'd been conducting my own thorough examination of our shared life, and the discoveries were both infuriating and liberating. The joint investment account Robert managed exclusively? He'd been gradually moving money into accounts with only his name attached, apparently preparing for a future that didn't include me. The life insurance policy that was supposed to secure my future? The beneficiary had been quietly changed to his mother 6 months ago. Most damning of all were the documents hidden in his study, papers I'd discovered during a careful search while he was at one of his working dinners. Robert had been quietly consulting with a divorce attorney for over a year, building a case that would paint me as an unstable, incompetent wife whose emotional problems had made the marriage untenable. The irony was breathtaking. While Robert plotted to discard me as damaged goods, he continued to use me as entertainment at social gatherings, apparently convinced that I was too dim to notice his preparations for my disposal. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mom, can we have lunch today? I need to talk to you about something important. 30 minutes later, I was seated across from my pregnant daughter at her favorite cafe, trying to read the mix of emotions on her face. At 7 months along, Sarah glowed with that radiant pregnancy energy, but today she looked troubled. Mom, she began carefully, Jake and I have been talking about Dad's behavior at the anniversary party. My stomach tightened. Oh? It wasn't okay. The way he talked about you, made jokes at your expense. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Jake was horrified. He asked me if Dad always treats you like that. I sipped my tea, buying time to formulate a response. Your father has his ways. That's not an answer, Mom. Sarah leaned forward, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. I'm about to become a mother myself, and I keep thinking about what kind of example I want to set for my child about relationships, about respect between partners. The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket. My daughter was asking the questions I'd been avoiding for years, seeing patterns I'd trained myself to accept as normal. What kind of example do you think I've set? I asked quietly. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You've shown me how to be patient and supportive and loyal. But Mom, you've also shown me how to make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. How to apologize for existing. The accuracy of her observation took my breath away. Sarah, I don't want my daughter to learn that love means accepting humiliation, she continued, her voice fierce with protective instinct. "I don't want my son to think it's acceptable to treat women the way Dad treats you." I reached across the table and took her hand. "What if I told you that things are about to change?" "What do you mean?" I studied my daughter's face, seeing so much of my younger self in her determined expression. "I mean that your mother isn't quite as helpless as she's appeared to be." Sarah's eyes widened. "Mom, are you planning to leave Dad?" "I'm planning to take back my life," I said carefully. "The details are still being worked out." Relief flooded Sarah's features. "Good. God, Mom, I've been so worried about you, watching. You shrink smaller and smaller every year, listening to Dad's constant criticism." She squeezed my hand. "You deserve so much better than that." After lunch with Sarah, I drove to my appointment with Elizabeth Morrison. No relation, despite the shared surname the divorce attorney Margaret had recommended. Her office was in a sleek downtown building, the kind of place that radiated competence and discretion. Elizabeth was a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd shepherded many women through the complicated process of extracting themselves from failed marriages. "Mrs. Morrison," she began after reviewing the documents I'd brought, "you've been remarkably thorough in your documentation." "I've had time to be thorough," Elizabeth smiled grimly. "Your husband's affair is certainly grounds for divorce, and his financial deception strengthens your position considerably. But I'm more interested in these documents suggesting he's been preparing to divorce you." She spread out copies of the papers I'd photographed in Robert's study. "He's been building a case for over a year, documenting what he characterizes as your emotional instability, your increasing dependence on him, your inability to manage basic household tasks." I felt my jaw clench. He's creating a narrative. Exactly. And if he'd succeeded in filing first, he might have convinced a judge that you were the unstable party in need of limited support. Elizabeth looked up from the papers. "But since you're here first, with evidence of his systematic preparation for divorce while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage, the narrative shifts considerably. What are my options?" Elizabeth leaned back in her chair. "Legally, you have several paths. You could file for divorce immediately based on adultery and financial misconduct. You'd likely receive a very favorable settlement. But you said on the phone that you wanted to explore all possibilities before making a decision. What exactly did you have in mind?" I took a deep breath. "Robert has spent 25 years systematically undermining my confidence, making me the subject of public ridicule, conditioning everyone we know to see me as incompetent and dependent. Simply divorcing him feels like letting him off too easily." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I understand the desire for justice. But revenge can be a dangerous game, Mrs. Morrison. It often costs more than it's worth." "What if it wasn't revenge?" I asked. "What if it was education?" "Explain." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this meeting. "Robert believes he's smarter than everyone around him, especially me. He's built his entire sense of superiority on the belief that I'm too stupid to understand his deceptions, too weak to challenge his behavior, too dependent to survive without him." Elizabeth examined the contents of the folder, detailed financial records, documentation of Robert's professional misconduct, evidence of his systematic preparation for divorce while maintaining his public image as a devoted husband. "What if," I continued, "instead of simply filing for divorce, we demonstrated to Robert and everyone in our social circle exactly how wrong he's been about his supposedly incompetent wife?" "That's a high-risk strategy," Elizabeth warned. "If you miscalculate, if he realizes what you're doing before you're ready." "He won't realize," I said with quiet confidence. "Robert's arrogance is his greatest weakness. He's so convinced of my limitations that he won't see the trap until it's too late." Elizabeth studied my face intently. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, I outlined my plan in detail. Elizabeth's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement to something approaching admiration as I walked her through each carefully considered step. This is either brilliant or completely insane, she said finally. Can't it be both? Mrs. Morrison, if you pull this off, it will be the most spectacular comeuppance I've ever witnessed in 20 years of family law. But if it backfires, it won't backfire, I said firmly. I've spent 25 years studying Robert Morrison. I know exactly how he thinks, how he reacts, what triggers his responses. He's about to discover that his incompetent wife has been taking notes all along. Elizabeth smiled for the first time during our meeting. When do we begin? Phase 1 starts tonight. Robert thinks he's coming home to the same obedient, ignorant wife he left this morning. Instead, he's going to encounter the first small crack in his carefully constructed reality. That evening, Robert arrived home at nearly 9 o'clock, reeking of expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie askew, and he wore the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd successfully deceived his simple wife yet again. Sorry I'm late, Helen, he said, not sounding sorry at all. The Peterson case required extensive overtime. I looked up from my book, not one of the romance novels he always mocked, but a dense legal text on family, law I'd been studying. How's the case progressing? Slowly. Complex legal issues require careful analysis. I'm sure they do. I marked my place in the book and closed it carefully. Robert, I've been thinking about our anniversary party. His entire body tensed almost imperceptibly. Oh? Yes. I realize I never properly thanked you for all those wonderful stories you shared about me. Relief flickered across his features. Well, everyone seemed to enjoy them. They certainly did. I smiled sweetly. In fact, they were so entertaining that I've been thinking about sharing some stories of my own at the Hendersons' dinner party this Saturday. Robert's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. Stories? About you, of course. Fair is fair, don't you think? I have some absolutely fascinating tales about your recent business trips, your dedication to client service, your commitment to working those long, hard hours. The color began draining from Robert's face as the implications of my words sank in. For the first time in 25 years, he was looking at his wife with something approaching uncertainty. Helen, he said carefully, what kind of stories? I stood up, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. Oh, don't worry, darling. They'll be just as amusing as yours were. After all, everyone loves a good story about dedication and hard work, don't they? As I walked past him toward the stairs, I paused and patted his shoulder gently. Sweet dreams, Robert. You have another big day of client consultation tomorrow, don't you? Behind me, I heard the soft sound of ceramic hitting hardwood as Robert's coffee mug slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The Henderson dinner party arrived with the weight of destiny. Saturday evening found me standing before my bedroom mirror, applying lipstick with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the apologetic wife who had endured public humiliation 4 weeks ago. Robert appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He'd been walking on eggshells all week, ever since my casual mention of sharing stories about his dedication to work. The psychological pressure was clearly taking its toll. He'd barely eaten, hadn't touched his expensive scotch, and I'd caught him staring at me with undisguised wariness. Helen, he said carefully, about tonight. Perhaps we should skip the Hendersons. I'm not feeling well. I turned from the mirror with a bright smile. Skip it? Don't be silly, Robert. You love the Hendersons' parties. Besides, I've been looking forward to sharing my stories all week. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. What stories exactly? Oh, you know, amusing anecdotes about married life, the kind you're so good at telling. I smoothed my black dress, not the modest, matronly styles I'd worn for years, but something sleek and confident that actually flattered my figure. I've been practicing my delivery. You'll be so proud. Robert's reflection in the mirror looked like a man facing execution. The Henderson home blazed with warm light and the sound of conversation as we arrived. Karen Henderson, resplendent in her hostess role, greeted us with the kind of effusive welcome that made every guest feel special. "Helen, you look absolutely radiant tonight," she exclaimed, and I caught the surprised glances from other guests who hadn't seen me looking confident in years. And Robert, always the distinguished gentleman. Robert managed a weak smile, his hand trembling slightly as he accepted a glass of wine from the server. The guest list was perfect for my purposes. A carefully curated mix of Robert's law firm colleagues, our neighbors, and several members of ER, the country club where Robert had held court for years. Everyone who had witnessed my public humiliation over the years was present to witness what came next. For the first hour, I played the part of the charming dinner guest, engaging in conversations about books I'd actually read, current events I'd been following, and local politics I understood far better than anyone realized. Several people commented on how articulate and well-informed I seemed, as if they'd never really listened to me before. Robert hovered nearby like a guard dog, his anxiety palpable as he waited for me to drop whatever bombshell I'd been threatening. But I was savoring the anticipation, letting the tension build like a perfectly crafted legal argument. The moment arrived during coffee and dessert, when the conversation naturally turned to amusing stories about married life. Bill Henderson launched into a tale about his wife's attempt to fix their garbage disposal, and soon everyone was sharing lighthearted anecdotes about domestic mishaps and marital miscommunications. "Robert," called out Tom Mitchell from the law firm, "you always have the best stories about married life. Share something with us." Robert's face went ashen. "Oh, I don't really—" "Actually," I interrupted smoothly, rising from my chair with graceful confidence, "I thought tonight I might share a few stories about my dear husband. After all, fair is fair." The room fell quiet, sensing the subtle shift in atmosphere. Robert's wineglass trembled in his hand as all eyes turned to me. "You know," I began conversationally, "everyone always compliments Robert on his dedication to his work. The long hours, the attention to detail, the way he throws himself completely into every case." I smiled warmly at my husband, whose face had gone completely white. What they don't realize is just how creative he is in his client consultation methods. A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. Robert looked like he might faint. "For instance," I continued, warming to my theme, "Robert has discovered that some of his most productive case discussions happen over intimate lunches at expensive restaurants. He's found that a relaxed atmosphere really helps with the exchange of ideas." "That makes sense," Karen Henderson said supportively, not yet sensing the trap being laid. "Oh, it does indeed. In fact, Robert has been having extensive lunch consultations with one particular paralegal, Vanessa Chen, such a dedicated young woman, every Tuesday and Thursday for months. Sometimes these working lunches extend well into the evening. Sometimes they require overnight accommodations at the downtown Marriott." My voice remained pleasant, conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. "I so admire his commitment to thorough research." The room had gone dead silent. Robert's wineglass slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering against the Hendersons' hardwood floor in a shower of crystal and red wine. "Helen," he whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. But I wasn't finished. 25 years of stored humiliation had found its voice, and that voice was calm, articulate, and devastatingly precise. "And the financial creativity," I continued, stepping gracefully away from the spreading pool of wine. "Robert has found ingenious ways to make his firm's clients pay for these educational experiences. The hotel bills, the expensive dinners, the jewelry purchases that help maintain good working relationships, all carefully itemized as case-related expenses." Several of Robert's law firm colleagues were now staring at him with expressions of growing horror. I could see the mental calculations happening as they processed the implications of what I was describing. "Helen, please." Robert tried again, but his voice was barely audible. I moved to the center of the room, owning the space with a confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Robert's professional dedication is his long-term planning. Did you know he's been preparing for a major career transition for over a year? He's been so concerned about his future security that he's consulted extensively with divorce attorneys, restructured our financial arrangements, and even changed the beneficiaries on our life insurance policies, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband and father. The silence in the room was deafening. Dorothy Morrison, my mother-in-law, was staring at her son with an expression of absolute disgust. Margaret was smiling with fierce pride. Sarah, whom I'd specifically asked Karen to invite, was recording everything on her phone while her husband Jake watched in amazement. The attention to detail has been remarkable, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Robert has spent countless hours documenting what he characterizes as my emotional instability, my dependence on him, my inability to manage even basic household tasks. He's created such a compelling narrative of my incompetence that he fully expected to convince a judge that I was the unstable party in our marriage. Robert tried to stand, swaying slightly. This isn't... You don't understand... Oh, but I do. Understand, I said, turning to face him directly. I understand that you've underestimated your wife for 25 years. You see, while you were busy with your creative billing practices and your paralegal consultations, I was conducting my own research project. I pulled a thick folder from my purse and set it on the Hendersons' coffee table. Photographs, bank, records, hotel receipts, billing statements, email communications, all meticulously documented and verified by a private investigator. Every lie cataloged, every deception exposed, every instance of professional misconduct recorded. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Robert's colleagues were exchanging meaningful glances, no doubt already calculating the damage to the firm's reputation. But here's the most interesting discovery, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Robert has been systematically moving our joint assets into accounts bearing only his name, apparently preparing to leave me destitute while he starts fresh with his young paralegal. The same woman whose salary, I might add, has been mysteriously increased 3 times in the past year, using funds that should have gone toward the firm's profit-sharing plan. Tom Mitchell stepped forward, his face grim. Robert, is this true? Robert opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. No words came. The State Bar Association has been very interested in my findings, I continued pleasantly, particularly the evidence of client fund misappropriation and fraudulent billing practices. The Ethics Committee has scheduled a hearing for next week. Dorothy, Morrison finally found her voice. Robert James Morrison, what have you done? But Robert was beyond response. The man who had spent decades mocking my intelligence was discovering that his supposedly dim wife had outmaneuvered him completely. I walked over to where he stood swaying and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. 25 years. Robert, 25 years of making me feel small, stupid, and worthless. Of turning me into a punchline for your entertainment. Did you really think I was too ignorant to notice? Too weak to fight back? His eyes filled with tears, not of remorse, but of shocked recognition that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The divorce papers will be served Monday morning, I said, my voice still gentle but implacable. You'll find? The terms quite different from what you were planning. Adultery and financial misconduct have a way of influencing settlement negotiations. I turned back to the stunned room. I want to thank all of you for being such a wonderful audience over the years. Your laughter at Robert's jokes taught me an important lesson about the difference between being laughed with and being laughed at. The silence stretched like a held breath until Sarah stood up, began clapping slowly, deliberately. Jake joined her, then Margaret, then, to my amazement, several others. Not everyone, but enough to make the point clear. Now, I said brightly, I should probably head home. I have an early appointment with my attorney tomorrow to finalize some business matters. As I moved toward the door, Robert grabbed my arm, desperately. Helen, wait. We can work this out. I can explain everything. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then met his eyes with the steady gaze of a woman who had finally found her strength. Robert, I said quietly, there's nothing left to explain, and there's nothing left to work out. You made your choices over 25 years, and now you get to live with the consequences. I gently removed his hand from my arm. Oh, and one more thing. The house keys have been changed. Your belongings are packed and waiting at your mother's house. I thought it was time you experienced what it feels like to depend on someone else's charity. The drive home was surreal. For the first time in decades, I felt completely, authentically myself. Not the diminished version Robert had created, not the apologetic shadow I'd become, but the confident, intelligent woman I'd been before I'd allowed someone else to define my worth. My phone buzzed with text messages as word of the evening's revelations spread. Sarah, Mom, I am so proud of you. You're my hero. Margaret, that was the most magnificent thing I've ever witnessed. Even some surprising supporters, Karen Henderson. You handled that with such grace and dignity. Robert never deserved you. But it was the final message that meant the most. From Dr. Walsh, my physician. Helen, I don't know what's happened, but you look like a completely different woman. You're glowing with health and confidence. Whatever changes you've made, keep making them. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my newly redecorated home, making coffee for one and actually enjoying the solitude. The divorce had been finalized with terms that ensured my financial security for life. Robert's legal career was in ruins, the Bar Association having suspended his license pending a full investigation of his misconduct. His relationship with Vanessa had collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny, and the realization that her lover was unemployable in the legal profession. Sarah had given birth to a beautiful daughter, whom she'd named Helen Catherine after her grandmother and me. I want her to grow up knowing that women don't have to accept being diminished, she'd said, placing my granddaughter in my arms for the first time. The country club had quietly revoked Robert's membership after the financial irregularities came to light. Dorothy Morrison, in a stunning reversal, had publicly apologized to me at the grocery store, admitting that she'd enabled her son's behavior for far too long. But the sweetest vindication came from an unexpected source. 3 other wives from our social circle had approached me quietly, asking for advice about their own situations. It seemed that Robert's downfall had inspired other women to examine their marriages more critically, to stop accepting humiliation, disguised as affection. I'd returned to school, using the generous divorce settlement to pursue a doctorate in women's studies, with a focus on domestic psychological abuse. My thesis topic, the gradual erosion of self-worth in long-term marriages, how systematic humiliation becomes normalized. My professor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had been fascinated by my first-hand research. Your case study approach is remarkably thorough, she'd said during our last meeting. The documentation you've provided offers invaluable insight into how intelligent, educated women can be conditioned to accept diminishment over time. The doorbell interrupted my morning reverie. I opened it to find a delivery man with a large bouquet of flowers. Helen Morrison? Yes, that's me. He handed me the arrangement along with a small card. The flowers were beautiful, white roses and lilies, elegant and sophisticated. The card was from Robert. Helen, it read in his familiar handwriting, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you might find it in your heart to understand that I never meant to hurt you. I loved you the best way I knew how. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand how I became the man who could treat his wife so badly. I hope you're happy. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Always, Robert. I read the note twice, then placed it on my kitchen counter while I arranged the flowers in a vase. They were beautiful, and I could accept them as a gesture of genuine remorse without it meaning I had to forgive or forget the 25 years of systematic diminishment that had preceded this moment of clarity. The woman who had accepted humiliation, as love would have seen those flowers as a sign that Robert had changed, that he wanted her back, that their marriage could be saved. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was Helen Catherine Morrison, soon to be Dr. Helen Catherine Morrison, and I had learned the difference between love that builds you up and control that tears you down. I placed the vase on my dining room table, where the flowers complemented. The room I'd redecorated in colors that made me happy rather than shades Robert had preferred. Then I returned to my coffee and the dissertation chapter I was writing about the psychology of public humiliation in intimate relationships. Outside my window, the world continued its daily rhythm, but I was no longer watching it from the sidelines. I was participating, contributing, thriving in ways I'd forgotten were possible. The revenge I'd taken on Robert hadn't been about cruelty, it had been about truth. About refusing to let 25 years of lies continue unchallenged. About showing everyone, including myself, that the incompetent woman Robert had created existed only in his imagination and his need to feel superior. The real Helen Morrison had been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. And now, finally, she was home. My phone rang, interrupting the peaceful morning. It was Patricia Hendricks, my private investigator, who had become something of a friend during our months of working together. Helen, I wanted you to know that 3 more women have contacted my office, she said without preamble. They all mentioned hearing about your case and wanting help with their own situations. You've started something important here. These women are finding the courage to stop accepting unacceptable treatment because they saw how you handled your situation with dignity and intelligence. After we hung up, I sat in my sunny kitchen and realized that this was the true victory. Not Robert's downfall, though that had been satisfying in its completeness. The real triumph was in discovering that I could inspire other women to value themselves enough to demand better treatment. The anniversary party that had triggered my awakening felt like it had happened to someone else entirely. In a way, it had. That diminished, apologetic woman who had smiled while her husband made her a laughingstock was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and absolutely unwilling to settle for less than she deserved. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to the future, my future. Shaped by my choices and bounded only by my own limitations, not someone else's need to feel superior. It was, I realized, the perfect ending to a very imperfect marriage and the perfect beginning to the rest of my authentic life. The end. Up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.